The restaurant fell into a suffocating hush the moment Zariah Cole stepped out of the shadows. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a gunshot in Luca D'Angelo's world, the instinctive quiet of prey sensing a predator. But today, the predator was already seated. Luca, the man they called the Bald Reaper, sat at the head of a linen-draped table, his tailored black suit fitting like a second skin, while his eyes, obsidian and unreadable, remained fixed on the wine swirling in his glass. He was a man accustomed to immediate obedience, a man whose very presence caused the senior waiters at the restaurant to move with practiced, trembling efficiency. Zariah didn't look like she belonged in a world of concealed weapons and cold authority. She was 7 years old, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, wearing a white Sunday dress that stood out against the dim, amber lighting of the restaurant like a flare in the dark. Her hands were clasped tightly at her chest in a posture of silent prayer as she walked toward the corner booth where the city's underground was governed. Luca's bodyguards tensed, their hands straying toward their jackets, eyes darting to their boss for a signal to intervene. Luca didn't look up, yet he raised a single, manicured hand. The motion was slight, but absolute. The men froze. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the little girl reached the edge of the table. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. With a bravery born from pure desperation, Zariah reached out and slipped a small, folded piece of paper into the pocket of Luca's $5,000 jacket. "It's a picture I made for you," she whispered, her voice cutting through the tension, like a blade through silk. For the first time in years, someone had surprised the man who controlled half the city. Luca's gaze shifted from his glass to the girl, his expression remaining a neutral mask, though something flickered in his dark eyes. Curiosity, or perhaps a sudden, destabilizing suspicion. Zariah didn't flinch. She searched his face for a flicker of mercy, then turned and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Luca reached into his pocket with controlled, steady fingers and withdrew the note. He unfolded the scrap of paper, revealing a crude but haunting crayon drawing of his own face. Beneath the image, written in the shaky, earnest script of a child, were 5 words that made the Reaper go absolutely still. "Please don't kill my mama today." The silence in the restaurant didn't just deepen, it shattered. The heavy oak door of his private office clicked shut, sealing Luca D'Angelo into a world of leather-bound silence and the faint scent of expensive tobacco. He did not sit at his desk. Instead, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights below sprawling like a grid of golden shadow that he claimed to own. From his pocket, he withdrew the scrap of paper. It felt lighter than a bullet, yet, as he smoothed it out on the mahogany surface, it seemed to carry a weight that unsettled his practiced composure. The drawing was crude, rendered in the waxy blunt strokes of a cheap crayon. It was a portrait of a man, bald, sharply dressed, and seated with the rigid posture of a king. To anyone else, it was a child's simple observation of the Bald Reaper, a monster built on a foundation of fear and surgical elimination. But as Luca studied the lines, his eyes narrowed. Zariah hadn't drawn the jagged scar on his left shoulder or the cold, predatory curve of his jaw that kept his rivals at bay. Instead, she had focused on his eyes. In the center of the obsidian depths she had colored, there were tiny, hollow circles left white. They weren't just reflections of light, they were voids. The girl hadn't drawn a monster to be feared, she had drawn a man who looked profoundly alone. She had captured a haunting, subterranean sadness, a grief recognized by a child who spent her days watching the world from the shadows of a restaurant kitchen. Luca touched his own face, his fingers grazing the sharp jawline he had used as armor for decades. For years he had sanitized his soul to handle the business of death, believing that distance was his greatest strength. He had built his empire on the idea that he was a title, not a man. Yet this 7-year-old had bypassed the tailored suit and the reputation, looking straight into a fracture in his spirit that he hadn't known was visible. He stared at the 5 words scrawled at the bottom. "Please don't kill my mama today." The request was simple, yet it implied that Zariah saw him as someone capable of a choice. It destabilized the absolute logic of his world. If he was the monster everyone believed him to be, the mother's debt was a closed ledger. But if he was the man in the drawing, the one with the hollow eyes, then the ledger was suddenly, dangerously open. The blue glow of the computer monitor cast a harsh, artificial light across Luca's face as he pulled up the digital file for Renee Cole. He expected to find the usual history of a debtor, gambling habits, reckless spending, or the frantic greed of someone trying to cheat the D'Angelo family. Instead, the data scrolling before him revealed a slow, agonizing descent that had nothing to do with malice. Renee wasn't a criminal or a player in the city's underground. She was a casualty of the very machine Luca had spent his life perfecting. The file showed a mountain of debt inherited from a husband who had died 3 years prior, a man who had borrowed from the D'Angelo associates to keep a failing business afloat. Renee had been making payments for 36 months, working double shifts at Vincenzo's while her daughter, Zariah, waited in the kitchen. She had sold her car, her jewelry, and finally her pride, just to keep the interest from swallowing them whole. But in Luca's world, the interest was designed to be a bottomless pit. The system was built to ensure that once someone entered the ledger, they never truly left. Luca leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the office pressing in on him. He saw the ledger entries not as numbers, but as the stolen hours of a woman trying to buy back her life, one shift at a time. She was a victim of the blood prices his empire demanded, a survivor trapped in a brutal cycle of obligations she couldn't undo. Every dollar she had scraped together was another brick in the fortress of his authority. He looked again at the crayon drawing still resting on his desk. Zariah hadn't just drawn a man with hollow eyes. She had drawn the architect of her mother's misery. The realization was a cold, sharp blade to his conscience. For years, he had told himself that his business was about order and hierarchy, but the file on Renee Cole told a different story. It told the story of a woman who had done everything right and was still marked for erasure because she could no longer satisfy a math that was designed to be cruel. The deadline for the final payment was tonight, and the enforcers were already checking their watches. For the first time, Luca felt the weight of his own crown, realizing that the empire he built was powered by the desperation of people like Renee, who had no family empires to fall back on. The hallway of the apartment building smelled of floor wax and old wood, a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive scent of Luca's private office. He stood in the shadows, his tailored suit a dark stain against the peeling wallpaper, listening to the muffled sounds of life behind apartment 4B. This was meant to be a collection visit, a cold, final assessment of the assets before the Reaper's scythe descended. But as he pressed his back to the wall, he found himself paralyzed by the sound of laughter. It was Zariah's voice, bright and rhythmic, narrating a story about a king who lived in a castle made of glass. Then came Renee's voice, tired but remarkably soft, as she hummed a melody that smoothed the jagged edges of the girl's excitement. Through the thin door, Luca could hear the scrape of a chair and the clatter of a single plate being shared. He had expected to find a house of mourning, a place where the atmosphere was thick with the terror of his own reputation. Instead, he found a sanctuary of normalcy built on the fragile strength of a mother's love. Renee was telling Zariah about her day at the restaurant, omitting the fear that must have clawed at her throat every time a black car pulled up to the curb. She spoke of the future, of a weekend they would spend at the park, and the new books they would read, as if the deadline for her life wasn't ticking toward midnight. She was shielding her child with a desperate, quiet dignity, maintaining the illusion of safety while the shadow of the D'Angelo empire hovered just outside her door. Luca looked down at his hands, the same hands that had signed away lives with the stroke of a pen. Standing there, an uninvited ghost in their hallway, he realized that he wasn't just collecting a debt. He was an intruder in a world of genuine connection that he had long ago traded for a title. He had come to see the woman who owed him money, but he found a woman who was richer than he could ever be. He didn't knock. He couldn't. The bald reaper stayed in the dark, watching the sliver of warm light beneath the door, realizing that if he stepped into that light, the normalcy Renee had fought so hard to maintain would shatter instantly. For the first time, the isolation of his power felt less like a fortress and more like a cage. He turned and walked away into the night, the sound of Zariah's laughter following him down the stairs like a haunting reminder of the life he was supposed to end. The air inside the back room of the social club was thick with the scent of espresso and the unspoken tension of men who lived by the clock of the street. Marco, Luca's second-in-command, stood by the card table, his eyes tracking the boss with a predatory sharpness that hadn't been there a week ago. Marco was a man of the old code, a believer in the mechanical nature of Mafia justice, where an unpaid debt was a death warrant, no exceptions and no delays. To him, the coal problem wasn't a matter of ethics, it was a test of the empire's structural integrity. "The sun is down, Luca," Marco said, his voice a low gravel that didn't carry the usual notes of deference. "The deadline for the woman at Vincenzo's passed 3 hours ago. My men are sitting in their cars, waiting for the word that never came." He leaned against the table, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "People are talking. They saw the girl at the restaurant. They saw you take the note. They're wondering if the Reaper has lost his edge." Luca didn't look up from the ledger, his bald head reflecting the dim overhead light, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In this world, hesitation was a contagion. If the boss was seen as going soft for a child's crayon drawing, the fear that held their rivals at bay would evaporate, potentially sparking a coup that would drown the city in blood. Marco wasn't just asking for an order. He was measuring the height of the throne, looking for a crack in the armor he had helped maintain for a decade. "I'm handling it, Marco," Luca replied, his voice maintaining a cold, absolute authority that lacked its usual conviction. "Handling it looks like silence," Marco countered, stepping closer. "And silence looks like weakness. If Renee Cole is still breathing by morning, every debtor in this city will think they can pay us in drawings instead of dollars." He paused, his hand hovering near his jacket in a gesture that was half habit, half threat. "If you can't pull the trigger on this one, Luca, the family will find someone who can." Luca finally looked up, his obsidian eyes locking onto Marco's with an intensity that made the other man hesitate. But the seed of doubt had been planted. As Luca watched his second-in-command walk away, he realized the clock wasn't just ticking for Renee Cole anymore, it was ticking for him. The system he had built was turning its gears against its architect, and the price of mercy was becoming a debt he might have to pay with his own life. The afternoon sun filtered through the autumn leaves, casting long, skeletal shadows across the park bench where Luca sat alone. He had traded his usual black suit jacket for a dark overcoat, trying to blend into the scenery of joggers and young families, but he still radiated the heavy, unnatural stillness of a man who lived outside the law. When Zariah appeared, skipping ahead of her mother who sat several yards away on a distant lawn, she didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the bench beside the man the city called a demon, her small legs dangling, seemingly oblivious to the fear he inspired in grown men. For a long moment, they simply watched the wind ripple across the duck pond. Luca felt the weight of the crayon drawing in his breast pocket, a silent anchor in the storm of his own thoughts. He looked at his hands, hands that had ordered the destruction of empires and the silencing of witnesses, and then at the child who had dared to look him in the eye. "Do you know who I am, Zariah?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like a shifting of tectonic plates. He spoke in metaphors, the only way he knew how to navigate the chasm between their worlds. In this city, there are monsters and there are kings. The monsters take what they want, and the kings decide who gets to keep what they have. Zariah turned her head, her wide, perceptive eyes searching his face with a terrifying clarity. "You aren't a monster," she said, her voice filled with the absolute certainty of the innocent. She reached out, her small, warm hand resting briefly over his knuckles where the skin was scarred from a life of violence. "I saw you at the restaurant. You held my note so gently, like it was a bird. My mama says you can tell a person by how they hold things." Luca tensed, a cold shiver of vulnerability tracing his spine. "You should be afraid, little one," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Everyone else is. The world I live in doesn't have room for people like you." "I'm not afraid," she countered, swinging her legs and looking back at the pond. "Because you have kind hands. I saw it when you touched the paper. A monster would have crumpled it up. A king would have ignored it, but you kept it." The intimacy of her words hung in the air, a confession that stripped Luca of his armor. He had spent a lifetime building walls so high that even language became a barrier, yet this child had dismantled them with a single observation. He realized then that Zariah didn't see the bald reaper or the architect of a death spiral. She saw a man who was still capable of choice. As she skipped back toward Renee, Luca stayed on the bench, his hands trembling slightly in the cool air, realizing that the kindness she saw was the most dangerous weakness he had ever possessed. The sky over the city bled into a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the jagged skyline, signaling the end of Renee Cole's final day. In the back of a blacked-out SUV idling 2 blocks from the apartment, Marco checked the action on his pistol, the metallic click echoing the cold finality of the hour. He didn't need an order anymore. He had interpreted Luca's silence as a test of the family's resolve, a vacuum of power that needed to be filled by someone with a steady hand. To Marco and the men gathered in the shadows, loyalty wasn't found in a child's drawing, but in the ruthless maintenance of the ledger. They believed they were saving the D'Angelo empire from the creeping rot of sentimentality, preparing to erase a debt that the boss seemed too haunted to collect. Inside the apartment, Renee moved with the heavy, frantic energy of someone who knew the air was running out. She checked the locks for the 4th time, her eyes darting to the window every time a car's headlights swept across the ceiling. She had tried to keep the world normal for Zariah, but the illusion was fraying at the edges as the shadows in the hallway grew longer and more predatory. She clutched a kitchen knife with white-knuckled intensity, a pathetic defense against a machine of death she couldn't see but could feel closing in. She didn't know about the park meeting or the kind hands her daughter had seen, She only knew that the Reaper's deadline was a wall she couldn't climb. The enforcers stepped out of the vehicle, their movements synchronized and silent, ghosting toward the building's entrance. They didn't talk. There was a grim, professional understanding that by morning the Cole problem would be a memory, and the D'Angelo name would once again be synonymous with fear. They were proving their loyalty by finishing what their boss had started, unaware that they were about to trigger a war with the very man who had taught them how to fight. As they reached the third-floor landing, the city seemed to hold its breath, caught between the mechanical laws of the past and the uncertain mercy of the man who still carried a crayon drawing over his heart. The sound of the apartment door splintering under a heavy boot was the final note in the symphony of terror that had been building since sunset. Marco's men moved with the mechanical precision Luca had personally drilled into them, their shadows spilling into the small living room like ink. Renee screamed, a sound of raw, jagged instinct, as she thrust Zariah behind her, the kitchen knife trembling in her hand, a silver spark against a wall of black suits. To the enforcers, this was merely a transaction being finalized, a blood price being collected to balance a ledger that had remained open for too long. But before the lead hitter could close the distance, the hallway behind them exploded in a blur of motion. A heavy gloved hand caught the man's collar, hurling him into the drywall with a force that shook the building. Luca D'Angelo stepped through the wreckage of the doorway, his overcoat flared like wings, his eyes radiating a cold, lethal fury that silenced the room more effectively than any gunshot. He didn't look like a king or a businessman. He looked like the monster the city feared, but his teeth were bared at his own kind. "Boss!" Marco stammered, his weapon lowered in a moment of paralyzing confusion. "We're handling it. We're fixing the weakness." "You're violating an order!" Luca's voice was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the floorboards. He stepped between the guns and the mother, his broad back a wall of iron that shielded Renee and Zariah from the world of violence he had created. "The ledger is closed. I am the only one who decides who breathes in this city, and I've decided you're leaving." The tension was a physical weight, a thin wire stretched to the point of snapping. Marco looked at his men, then at the man who had built their empire, realizing that the Bald Reaper was no longer acting for the family, but for the girl who had dared to see him as human. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the apartment would become a tomb for everyone inside. Then, sensing the absolute lethality in Luca's posture, the readiness to burn his entire world down to protect this one room, Marco slowly lowered his head. He gestured for his men to retreat, their silence now heavy with the taste of a failed coup. As the enforcers melted back into the shadows of the hallway, Luca didn't turn around. He stood still, his breath heavy, listening to the frantic, sobbing gasps of the woman behind him and the small, quiet heartbeat of the child who had changed everything. He had broken the chain of his. The morning sun rose cold over the city, but inside the D'Angelo Social Club, the atmosphere was frozen in a different way. Luca sat at his mahogany desk, the silence of the room heavier than it had been in decades. On the blotter before him lay the physical ledger of the Cole family, a thick stack of paper detailing 3 years of interest, penalties, and blood prices. With a steady hand, Luca picked up a fountain pen and drew a single thick line through the name Renee Cole. Beside it, in the space reserved for the method of settlement, he wrote 2 words that would baffle his accountants for years: paid in full. He knew the cost of that line. In the hallways of his empire, whispers were already moving like a slow-acting poison. Marco and the others would see this as a crack in the foundation, a sign that the Bald Reaper had finally developed a soul, a luxury a Mafia boss could rarely afford. But as Luca closed the book, He didn't feel weak. He felt a strange, terrifying clarity. He was still the boss, still the man whose name could halt the heartbeat of the docks, but the machine no longer ran him. He had reclaimed the power to choose. He stood and walked to the mirror, adjusting the lapels of his black suit. He reached into his inner breast pocket, his fingers brushing against the waxy texture of the folded crayon drawing. He didn't need to look at it to see the hollow eyes or the 5 words that had dismantled his life. It remained there, resting directly over his heart, acting as a thin paper shield against the darkness that waited for him every time he stepped out the door. It was a reminder that even a monster is seen as a man by someone, and that the kind hands Zariah spoke of were now his greatest responsibility. Luca stepped out into the hallway, his expression returning to the unreadable obsidian mask the world expected. His men fell into step behind him, their eyes downcast in instinctive obedience, unaware that their leader was carrying a child's prayer into battle. He would continue to govern the city, to manage the shadows and command the silence. But the ledger had changed. He wasn't just building an empire anymore. He was protecting the few flickers of light he had left in a world designed to blow them out. The monster was still there, but for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for.